For what reason was I born unto this earth? Do I even deserve to ask that question? I've killed so many, ended more lives than I can count. And for what? Training? A job? What right do I have to wish for more? Killua Zoldyck, heir to the Zoldyck family, a 1 in a million talent, born with the predetermined path to be a heartless killer, molded through endless hours of torture, training, and brainwashing, to think that he's nothing more than the job handed to him at birth. Yet, he never stops looking beyond the chains binding him, never stops yearning to be someone other than who he's expected to be, someone that can live a meaningful life far away from all the killing. The most important thing to keep in mind about Killua is the stark contrast between who he is and who he thinks he is. As a child, Killua showed nothing but kindness and warmth, the opposite of what he would later believe he was. He took care of his younger sister, attempted to befriend his servants, and showed empathy towards animals. Yet, these memories don't seem to reach him by the time he entered the hunter exam, as all he'd ever say about his childhood was that it was filled with torture and training. Why is that? It all comes back to Illumi's needle, a brainwashing technique his brother implanted in him to coerce him into believing he was a heartless assassin and to follow the doctrines of assassination, namely, to only engage in conflicts when success was guaranteed. Not only did Illumi's needle affect his actions and image of himself, it also affected his memory. He forgot about his sister, Aluka, forgot about his acts of kindness, forgot about who he was. All he remembered was who he was supposed to be. Killua consistently showed off his empathy, understanding the emotions of those around him, especially Gon, and acting to protect and nurture his best friend. He'd play, laugh, and joke around like a child, yet believed these behaviors were an act. He'd consistently compare himself to murderers like Hisoka, and say that his childhood demeanor was a facade he donned to trick others. But that was never the case. He simply was who he was, but believed he was no more than a killer because of his family's conditioning. His belief that he was nothing but a cold-hearted assassin manifested in his incredibly low self-esteem. While Gon saw him as a kind-hearted child with the ability to tap into his assassination mindset, Killua saw himself as a wolf in sheep's clothing, tricking his friends into believing he was kind while expressing his true nature in the shadows for the sake of the one that had shown a monster like him such kindness, exemplified when he threatened the other combatants in Heaven's arena without letting Gon in on his exploits. In reality, Gon would have been completely on his side if he'd known, but Killua felt as though he had to hide his darker side in order to keep Gon from seeing him as a monster. But there was a dichotomy to Killua's feelings towards himself and his family. While he was ashamed of the person he believed he was morally, he found pride in the high esteem in which his family held him. Unlike the nature of his personality, he resonated with the way his family praised his battle potential. It wasn't incongruous with the person he wanted to be, and he could be proud of it. He respected his father, and the fact that he held such high expectations for his son wasn't only a source of grief, but also of pride. Throughout the story, Killua showed time and time again how highly he saw his own battle prowess, which further pushed him to believe that the source of his power, his upbringing as an assassin, was his true self. When he was confronted by Illumi at the end of the hunter exam, he was reminded of every part of himself that he loathed. Illumi spelled out his family's conditioning, that Killua wished for nothing but murder, that in the end, he would be the cause of Gon's death. After defeatedly returning home, he would be saved by the one he would come to know as the Light, Gon Freaks. As he traveled with Gon, he he slowly started to relax and enjoy himself more and more. The stakes were low, and they were able to grow and learn Nen together. They'd then have a peaceful experience visiting Gon's hometown, where Killua's closest companion would ask him to travel the world with him. Things were looking up, and Killua was beginning to gain a sense of self-esteem. But then, when Yorknu came around, for the first time, they found themselves in a true life-or-death situation, and Killua was reminded of a part of himself that he loathed, a piece of him that had been implanted by his brother, Illumi, his cowardice. As he and Gon were being held captive by Nobunaga, he decided the only way to save the one he felt he owed everything to was to sacrifice himself. But his brother's curse stopped him in his tracks. He felt those chains he'd almost been able to forget winding themselves tightly around his neck, and for the first time since being confronted by his brother during the exam, he felt powerless and weak. He didn't dwell on it for too long though, as Gon was able to snap him out of it and find a way for them to both escape. But the memory of his chains was reignited and would patiently wait for the next time they'd hold him back from acting. A newfound fear that he would leave Gon to die would quietly fester until the day he could no longer bear being by his best friend's side, a misinterpretation of Illumi's words. He was afraid of being the cause of Gon's death, whereas in reality, the only reason Gon would ever die would be because of his own thoughtless recklessness. As Killua continued to adventure on with his friend, his growth continued despite the festering fear that he'd suppressed deep within him. The two of them grew more powerful as Nen users, and Killua began to allow himself to grow separately from his friend. Whereas in Heaven's Arena, he'd refused to train unless it was with Gon. In order to gain access to Greed Island, he'd train alone, which would inspire his friend to train as well. He became able to hold grudges for his own sake, whereas in Heaven's Arena, he didn't mind what tactics were used against him as long as the other combatants left Gon alone. In Greed Island, he would hold a petty rivalry with one of Razor's pirates for no one's sake but his own. This change was subtle but important. He was slowly learning to believe in himself, even if he still put Gon first in practically every respect. But Killua's growth would be put to the test in the Chimera Ant arc, as the stakes were raised to the highest they'd ever been. The festering fears and resentments that Killua had buried deep within himself would resurface with the existential threat of the Chimera Ants. His first test came as Pito attacked Kite. He was faced with a choice: stand and fight alongside Gon and Kite, or run away along with his friend. He made the intelligent choice to run, but that choice spelled the beginning of the rift that would grow between him and the one that had shown him the light. Fleeing from the beast, Killua's mind raced with turbulent emotions that Gon himself would spend the rest of the arc struggling with. Guilt, anger, self-loathing. He was a realist through and through and believed that Kite was dead, a belief that would soon prove to be correct. Gon, on the other hand, was a staunch optimist and refused to believe that Kite could die. With Gon's declaration that the two of them would soon rescue their master, Killua felt unable to share the unease that he felt, blinded by Gon's unyielding optimism. The light of optimism within Gon that would eventually collapse into the darkness of rage, shone in stark contrast to the dark realism within Killua that would eventually expand into the light of empathy. Killua's inability to share his unease out of fear would go on to be a reoccurring theme for the duration of the Chimera Ant arc. He didn't tell Gon that he planned to leave his side at Bisky's command. He didn't tell Gon that he planned to protect him for the duration of the time he was forced into Zetsu. And he didn't tell Gon of the unease he felt at the darkness he saw growing within his dearest friend. As Killua fought Shoot in order to stay by Gon's side, his brother's curse was reawakened, and he was reminded of the cowardice his family had hammered into him. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't break the chains that bound him, at least not for the sake of staying by his friend's side. But when the stakes were raised to saving Gon's life, well, that was another matter entirely. As Ramot beat Killua to a bloody pulp, his brother's curse hindering his ability to fight back, Ramot made one threat that changed everything. He threatened Gon's life, and Killua knew he would make good on that promise. Killua had never been able to see the light within himself and hated himself for the person he thought he was, but he had always been able to go above and beyond for the sake of his friend. The only thing stronger than his fear and self-loathing was his care for the one that had showed him that there could be more to life than murder. For the first time in his life, Killua truly rebelled against his family's conditioning, deciding to risk himself in order to save someone, instead of his family's instruction to think only of surviving. Mirrored by the literal removal of the needle Ilum he had placed within him, Killua fought past what he'd thought of himself and became something more, a protector, triumphantly and easily killing the rabid chimera ant. He may have overcome one aspect of his weakness, but several others remained. He may have overcome his fear of strong opponents and accepted his role of protector, but his fear of the darkness he saw growing within his partner remained. His self-esteem may have improved, but he still didn't think of himself as capable enough to help the friend he felt he owed everything to. His fear, along with his feelings of helplessness, coalesced into avoidance, causing him to refuse to acknowledge what he saw growing within his friend out loud. Then later, Killua became to Ikalgo what Gon had been to him, showing the octopus ant that he was more than he thought he could be, that he could find the light that he'd always felt was out of reach. But Killua had no idea how much his words meant to the ant. To him, he was just doing what felt natural. There was no longer even a semblance of a heartless killer, as without even trying, he was able to give life to those that were prepared to live a life of meaningless killing. As the darkness continued to consume Gon, Killua's feelings of helplessness and fear continued to grow until Gon exploded, distancing himself from the one that had never left his side. Killua's sense of ineptitude reached its peak, and he left his friend alone, convinced he was unable to be of any use. But then, by expressing his pain openly, something he'd been afraid to do, he was able to remind Palm of her dormant feelings, freeing her from the chains that had bound her. As he wept over his powerlessness, it was all too clear the power that he possessed. Just by being himself, he was able to free someone of their shackles. Through Ikalgo and Palm, Killua had saved two beings that had been bound in the same ways he had, one tied to the role of a killer, and the other bound by the chains of manipulation. And after being reminded by Palm, he came to understand the power that only he possessed. Even though he overcame his low self-esteem and fear of opening up, his fear of darkness remained, manifesting in his hurtful words towards Nanika, the being that lived within his sister, Aluka. To Aluka, there was no separation between herself and Nanika. Nanika was simply an extension of her. But in Killua's mind, Nanika was a dangerous unknown, an entity that reminded him both of the manipulation he'd experienced at the hands of his family and the darkness he'd seen consume his best friend. Nanika was an amalgamation of everything he'd learned to overcome, yet he was blind to that fact, attempting to push her away for the sake of his sister's safety. But Aluka's radical acceptance of herself cleared Killua's mind. He'd been so focused on fleeing from his family's expectations of him and attempting to save Gon that he'd never thought to accept what was, to take everything about himself, the aspects that he hated, the aspects that he loved, and radically accept them all. It was Aluka's display of radical acceptance that reminded him of what he'd had as a child, his empathy, his warmth. His past wasn't something he had to run away from, it was something he could accept and use in order to move forward and protect those that needed protecting. So with his newfound acceptance of himself and the world around him, he decided his purpose was exactly what it had always been: to live, to protect. This has been Evan. Thank you for watching. Hey everyone, I'd just like to let you know that I have a Patreon. Once I have 3 patrons for as little as $1 a month, you'll have access to a private Discord server where we can talk about anything from my future content to your favorite stories to anything really. You can ask me questions, I can ask you questions, it'll be a good time. And you get a bunch of different perks depending on what tier you decide to join. I'd be honored if you just checked it out. Supporting me would go a huge way in helping me continue to create content, raise the quality of that content, and maybe even raise the frequency of said content. So I'd really appreciate that, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.